Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Tim Hunt. I'm the CEO at the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine, and I'm delighted to introduce our first our moderator for this really exciting panel that we've got. This is part of our webinar series that we call Building the Future of Regenerative Medicine Executive Conversations, and it's really been well received within our community. It's an engaging series of 1 hour-long executive conversations designed to shed light on the latest advancements and challenges and transformative discussions shaping the future of regenerative medicine. And we've had some great speakers already. Back in May, we had Lonza led a panel talking about charting tomorrow, strategic insights on preparing to launch cell and gene therapies. In July, we had, was sponsored by JLL, we had a great conversation on strategic manufacturing, buy versus build for cell and gene therapies and the trade-offs in that framework. And today, I'm delighted we've got Mark Sawicki, the CEO of Cryoport Systems, talking about leading a panel on critical supply chain and logistics considerations for cell and gene therapy management. So really, I'm really looking forward to hearing this exciting panel. And I think most of you know Cryoport, but this is a really exciting and innovative company that's done some really groundbreaking and pioneering work. Jerry Shelton and Mark have done a tremendous job at really servicing our community. And I would say the word that comes to mind when I think of them is innovation. The conversations I've had with them have really been about, we've got a client, they've got a problem to solve, we're helping them solve the problem no matter what it is. So it's a really exciting company, and I'm delighted, Mark, that you're here today to lead this important discussion. So I'll turn it over to you and let you run the show from here.
Tim, thank you very much. We really appreciate the ability to step in and host this discussion today. Obviously, supply chain is near and dear to our heart, and our focus has been on building a fully integrated supply chain platform that allows the community to focus on development, from a scientific standpoint, as well as a scalability to push these groundbreaking therapies out into the market. And I have with me today two folks that I think you guys will really enjoy hearing from. So first is Natalie Sacarakis from IQVIA. So Natalie leads a logistics management program within IQVIA Cell and Gene Therapy Center of Excellence. And so she is responsible for design and implementation of logistics management strategies and resources for sponsors advancing their cell and gene therapies in clinical development. She has 16 years of experience in clinical research and clinical ops. And then also with us is Narinder Singh. Narinder is currently the CTO for Arcellx, which is Arcellx is a company that's trying to reimagine cell therapy for cancer and other incurable diseases. So Narinder is a biochemical engineer by training, has worked in the industry for over 25 years in both small and big pharma. So I'm going to turn it over to Natalie first, just to broaden her introduction slightly, and then Narinder before we get started here. So Natalie?
Yeah. Hey, everybody. Such a pleasure to join all of you today. Again, my name is Natalie Sacarakis. I sit in IQVIA's Cell and Gene Therapy Center of Excellence, and I'm also head of our logistics management strategy and logistics management and supply chain management program. And I've been in this role for over 3 years now. Started my career in the academic research institution setting, clinical research coordinator, and worked through clinical operations roles at CROs, and really have kind of, come to IQVIA to really build and progress our logistics management and supply chain management capabilities and our program and our offerings, and really excited about the discussion here today with Narinder to really walk through kind of some of the current challenges and current and future solutions in logistics and supply chain in cell and gene therapy. So with that, I will hand it over to Narinder.
Thank you, Natalie. My name is Narinder Singh. I've been with Arcellx for about 3 years. Been in the industry for 25, mainly the biologics industry for about 5 or 6, 8 years now in cell therapy. And boy, what a learning it has been. I feel like I just joined yesterday. And that's why I feel like a company like Arcellx and IQVIA, what you're doing at IQVIA and Cryoport, these type of collaborations through ARM or other such organizations are really critical to help fuel this nascent industry that really has the potential to transform people's lives at Arcellx itself, we are really trying to reimagine what the cell therapy could look like. And as you know, it has so much promise, but the biggest challenge is being able to control these more complex diseases and go beyond just the blood cancers, right? That has been a big challenge. So we have what we think is potentially best-in-class therapy with core technology called D-domain. It's basically a novel synthetic binder, fully synthetic binder that has very hydrophobic core. And because of that, we believe it is transduced to the T cells in a very effective way, and we have a very high surface expression. We have high manufacturing rate. And our lead product, CAR-DDBCMA, also now known as anito-cel, is in a phase 2 pivotal trial and is currently partnered with Kite. For our pipeline, we have Arcellx technology. So it's the same D domain is split into two pieces. One is a small protein molecule that contains the antigen binding domain, and the Arc cell becomes a universal cell. And with that, what you could do is mix and match different types of proteins and also control the protein. So this allows us to target multiple antigens at the same time, change the dosing based upon how the potential safety issues may be there or other issues may be there, simplify some of the logistics and all that. So that is a highly promising technology currently in phase 1 evaluation. With that, I'll turn it back to you, Mark.
Great, thank you, Narinder. Ali, can you go to the next slide for us, please? Next one. So just want to provide briefly a quick snapshot on the industry and what's going on before we dive in. And the reasoning behind this is that a lot of the investment environment and the market environment around clinical and commercial activity obviously has a manifest impact on supply chain strategy, in particular with the scalability in the industry. And obviously, as per much of the industry in the biopharma industry in general, financing over the last 2 years has been a bit tight, and we saw a significant drawdown from 21. We've seen, a lot of companies that have had to reprioritize, consolidate pipeline, focus on obviously key leads and tighten their belt, so to speak. But it does seem that we do see an improvement in the financing environment. First half of the year is basically where we were in 2023 for the full year, which means that we're moving in a positive direction. And ourselves, we see that obviously with supporting more than 70% of the clinical market, we've seen a return to growth as it relates to the number of programs that are being supported and the maturation of those programs. So that bodes well and obviously provides an exciting opportunity for the constituents on this call and obviously the cell and gene industry as a whole. Ali, can you go to the next? This obviously is a snapshot looking at that current clinical portfolio itself, and it's very healthy, and it continues to be healthy. And despite all of the turnover and churn, the overall number of programs in support has been relatively flat over the last 2 years, and is finally starting to climb, albeit very slowly right now. But one of the other things that we've seen, obviously, is a very nice diversification of programs. And Narinder touched on it, obviously moving from blood-based cancers or hematological cancers into solid tumors. But we're also seeing a significant interest in expansion in gene therapy targets and targeting, as evidenced by some of the recent approvals in that space, and a fair bit of the new pipeline that's pending to go to market over the next 12 to 18 months are gene therapy entities in themselves. But we're seeing a very nice diversification from that standpoint. So, Ali, if you go to the next. And this is the regulatory pipeline. There's already been 5 approvals year to date, with another 9 that have PDUFA dates or MAA action dates, and then another 4 beyond that. So, this is going to be a banner year as it relates to the number of programs that are likely to be approved. And all of this puts pressure, and this reason I wanted to show is it puts pressure on, obviously, the supply chains associated with limited infrastructure on a global basis. And so if you go to the next slide, this is an Oliver Wyman slide, but I think it's very poignant. And this is the basis in why supply chain is so critically important. If you look at the what I would call the legacy launches, right, and those are pre-2022, you know, the patient population or the market opportunity constituted just over 70,000 patients a year, assuming that you were able to access all of them. And patient accessibility obviously is a challenge throughout the globe at this point in time. With the launches over the last 2 years now, we're now eclipsing over 400,000 patients. And with some of the pipeline that we just talked about, as well as things that are a little bit further on, you can see a very, very clear progression to over 1.2 million potential patients on an annualized basis. And while that's a phenomenal opportunity for the space, you know, we have to be able to support that expansion. And one of the keys around that is, in addition to obviously manufacturing capacity, is to define and build out supply chain considerations that are able to support that type of volume from a scalability standpoint. And you know, the historical approach is not going to be sufficient or adequate for us to be able to obviously accommodate those patient volumes, assuming that we can actually tap into the total addressable patient population. And so that's kind of the basis for our mindset here as we walk through the discussion here today. Go ahead, Ali. So as it relates to supply chain, you know, the areas of consideration that we think about from our perspective is obviously the donor and or patient engagement and patient accessibility and collection processes, potentially cryopreservation if you have a cryo-in solution versus a fresh-in. If not, you have to obviously think about the logistics and considerations around fresh-in and making sure that you have all of the logistics and shipping considerations. Obviously, all the storage, fulfillment, secondary labeling, kitting considerations, transportation, and then obviously last mile and patient delivery, excluding the manufacturing, which is a whole challenge in itself, and we're not going to be focused on manufacturing today. All right. So we're going to be really focused on 5 different areas that we're going to talk about today. So one is availability of donor or patient-based starting material. Second is critical raw materials management, temperature controlled equipment management, data integration and data and visibility, and then fulfillment related activities. And so the first area that we want to focus on today is availability of donor and or patient-based starting material. And so this obviously ties into donor pool and management, but it also ties into patient accessibility as it relates to enrollment and engagement on a clinical standpoint, and then obviously on a commercial standpoint, you know, competing with a portfolio of existing therapies on the market today that are all fighting for the same bed space in these large teaching hospitals that are predominantly supporting this. So moving into the community care setting is going to be a significant consideration. So first and foremost is, you know, I want to talk first about you know, what limitations, you know, as it relates to donor and patient accessibility. We're focused on patient accessibility for Narinder to start because obviously they have an autologous platform. You want to talk about the patient journey as it relates to how you guys have managed that, Narinder, to start?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. This is one of the key things, right? We have live cell therapy, and for autologous cell therapy specifically, you talk about patient material, that becomes the starting material. And therefore, and patient comes in all shapes and sizes, different, you know, disease state and all different types of treatment that they have undergone through. So the cell experience, patient cell experience has been very, very varied. And the goal in this case is, of course, understanding that how can you design a process that can deliver a consistent, reliable product in the end, despite all that variability that you see up front, right? And the challenge there is, first, making sure that the product reaches the manufacturing facilities in the best shape possible. And this is where supply chain becomes the key, right? And company like even yours, leaders in this field, have really come up with really good, innovative solutions that help us deliver that material in the best state possible, right? So that to me is one of the biggest things. Obviously, the more important part is you're going to face all this variability. This is what you need to design for. So the process design needs to be really, really robust. And I'm really proud of our team, our process development team, our MSAT team, who have worked through all the details about what type of variability to expect and how can you address that in the process, including the challenges that you may face through shipping and supply chain, getting the material to the facility. So that part is critical.
So Narinder, how are you guys dealing with starting material variability as it comes into the manufacturing setting? Because that's been obviously a consistent issue for a lot of folks. Because when the clinical site in most cases directs the collection strategy today, as well as the equipment and the validation processes associated with that collection activity. So how are you guys dealing with that?
Well, I think the industry has done a good job in standardizing to these the collections, but it's still not, like you said, it's still not identical. We do see some changes. So the goal is then, can we design a process that can handle that variability? And oftentimes what we have seen is that if age is a key factor, if it takes a long time to deliver, not only it takes longer to now get it back to the patient, but also the quality of the cells begin to decrease. And you mentioned early on cryopreservation, like that's another key strategy where one can try to do cryopreservation right at the source or some center close by. And this is one place where the industry still needs to come together and find ways to do, as an industry versus every company finding their own solution. Could we have opportunities available where we could do cryopreservation at the source through the help of suppliers and our partners? So that's one thing I would say.
Yeah, Narinder, that's great. And I agree with that wholeheartedly, to be frank. I mean, that's one of the reasons that we're launching our IntegraCell platform, which is actually going live at the end of this quarter in Houston. And we have our first facility in Europe opening in early Q4 in Liege, Belgium. And that's really around building a fully integrated network of cryopreservation solutions that are fully standardized on a single quality platform to really drive that speed and turnaround time and flexibility and uniformity of product. And so that is something I think the industry is starting to look at. The only party that's obviously looking at that.
Thanks, Mark.
Natalie?
We are excited about that, but love to hear Natalie's thoughts.
So would I. Go ahead, Natalie.
Yeah, so I'll tackle this from a patient accessibility standpoint. I think obviously patient accessibility is really largely centered around how do you scale the number of sites that are comfortable, capable, and have the necessary infrastructure and training to really handle and manage these therapies. Not to mention, do they have capabilities to store the therapies, which is an entirely different discussion that we'll, I think, touch on in a little bit. One of the things we're trying to do at IQVIA is continue to grow and lean into what we call our cell and gene therapy site network. So the idea is to kind of always be seeking to advance the number of sites in different regions all across the globe that have the capabilities, the infrastructure, the tools, and the training necessary to really be proficient with these therapies. I mean, I think at the end of the day, things like on-site manufacturing are exciting, but we have to deal with the reality that we're faced with currently. And so, one key way to do that is to really expand the pool of sites that are capable and that are close to patients. And then, looking for ways that we can bridge that gap between the community care centers and the institutions that are used to running and handling these therapies and these types of trials. And being that bridge is one, really important piece that at IQVIA we're really looking to try to do. So again, I think particularly patient accessibility really starts with expanding that site pool that you can go to for these therapies.
Great. So I do have a question on here, and I'll let you guys answer. It says, are there any disadvantages such as efficacy and consistency to freezing twice eighth product as well as drug product? So, cryo in, cryo out basically versus a cryo out strategy. And Narinder, I don't know if you want to comment on that, or I'm happy to comment on that if you don't feel like you can.
I would be happy to hear your thoughts too, but here's the thing. Obviously, this is one of the key things everybody worries about is patient cells are the biggest source of variability, and treating them again and again, could that lead to further challenges like viability drop sometimes you see if the freezing is not done consistently. But we have done our own work on this, and we believe that you can cryopreserve safely. We believe you can actually use cryopreservation to have a better product. The challenge becomes, how do you scale it, and how do you make it available to all the centers in a way that is actually logistically possible, but also cost effective. So that's what I would love to hear, Mark, how you're thinking about it.
Yeah, I think obviously expediency is extremely important as it relates to product quality. You know, it doesn't make any sense to take 3 days, 2 days to move product into a cryopreservation environment, process and cryopreserve product, and then move it into manufacturing space. However, the data that we have internally and we've seen in the marketplace is that while you do see a slight impact on viability up front, by N+3 as it relates to the expansion of the product itself, that those products behave as per a fresh product would. And in fact, there's some early anecdotal information that they may be even slightly better over time. So I think that that's that's a very positive thing from that standpoint. But the other thing it does is it provides a significant amount of flexibility in manufacturing efficiency, right? And so cost of goods is a huge consideration for the space. And the more that we can optimize the manufacturing environment will drive that cost of goods down over time, which provides obviously the ability to be more cost effective in the market and to obviously drive adoption through HMOs and other activities where obviously reimbursement is a significant consideration. So, all right, Natalie, one other quick question here. In your cell and gene therapy site pool, are you finding that there are products that are going to require a hood to prepare? If so, what percentage of sites have this capability?
Sorry, can you repeat the products that are going to require what to prepare?
Going to require a hood to prepare. So controlled environment.
I mean, that obviously just depends on the product. I mean, in my kind of near-term experience, we haven't seen that a whole lot. I think certainly one of the things that you want to do from a strategic standpoint when you're identifying these sites is obviously directly match these sites as you're looking at individual therapies and what they're going to require. What we do is we have a checklist of different potential, resources, infrastructure, tools, capabilities. A hood is one of those things that we look at if a site has. And so you kind of want to develop a checklist of things you potentially would need. And then as you're looking at a specific asset, pair the sites with the needs for that asset. So I mean, as a percentage, it's really hard to say. I would certainly say less than, 30, 35% in my recent experience. But it's a good consideration, and one that when we're seeking out new sites and trying to identify those sites and their capabilities, that is one of the considerations among a larger list.
Thank you, Natalie. All right, I'm going to have one more question here, then we're going to move on to the next section just on a time consideration. So this one I'll answer. It says, how do you manage cell and gene therapy administration in rural areas away from major cities, right? And then how do you do it globally? Well, it's already being done globally, right? I mean, we support movement of cell and gene therapy materials in and out of over 160 countries on an annualized basis. So the distribution infrastructure already exists and is not a limitation. The real challenge as it relates to rural or what we call community care settings is really physician engagement, education, and then critical infrastructure of these sites to be able to support and manage these temperature critical materials. These are being looked at by those folks that have already been commercial for a period of time and are really trying to obviously drive patient accessibility. They are looking very, very hard right now on those strategies around community care engagement and being able to provide that education and that infrastructure out to those locations to make it possible for them to be able to support these types of therapies. So those are the two primary considerations at this point in time. So. All right, let's move on to the next question. So this is around critical raw materials. So critical raw materials, in particular during COVID, were a significant risk and issue. And this ties into two primary areas. One is availability. And the second is around single source availability of critical materials and consumables from a risk management standpoint. So cell and gene therapy has been historically, a relatively new therapy class compared to biologics or small molecules. And there's still a lot of single source options out there as it relates to some of those materials that are absolutely critical for the production. So Narinder, how are you guys dealing with this right now? And then Natalie, if you can also tie in, that'd be great.
Well, you mentioned this early as part of the slide on how rapidly this industry is growing. But the goal, of course, is to deliver scalable and cost-effective manufacturing. And even through product redesign, like I mentioned earlier, we're trying to do Arcellx redesign where you can have a universal cell product that can go to multiple different indications, multiple different therapies, and just modulating through the control antigen targeting through Sparks protein. So that could be an innovation that one could think of. The challenge with the current supply chain, or in this case, raw materials, is it takes a lot of process understanding, detailed process understanding to understand what exactly are the sources of availability and what is the impact. And oftentimes, in the race to early clinical trials, you only have limited amount of exposure. You could do 5-10 runs max, and you would still probably have a limited lots of raw materials that where you will have that exposure initially. So in this case, what we found pretty useful is continue to do that work as you're advancing through your phase 1, phase 2 trial extensively, rather than just focus on the patient manufacturing. And then working with the regulatory agencies, FDA has been really a great partner in making a case when you can make those changes. So yeah, starting material challenges are there. Raw material challenges are huge. And in this case, let me give you a very specific example. We saw some reagents in which even when the units are the same from one supplier to another, but the actual impact of that raw material was pretty different, dramatically different, several fold different in some cases. So even how these different suppliers measure their strength of their product is also different. So it's really important to invest time understanding each and every supplier and each every lot to lot variability of the material as well. We'd love to hear
So how are you dealing with single source though, Narinder? Because there is quite a few of those.
This is the challenge, right? The single source is what you get logged in. And then the goal is to, if single source works for you, then you make it work. And there are some really great suppliers out there who play that role. However, like you said, it creates its own supply chain challenges. You may not even have material available if the supplier is having a disruption. So our goal is to start to build in thoughtfully which are those, understand the risks around the supply, and thoughtfully start to build in the second sources.
Thank you, Narinder. Natalie, how are you guys dealing with it in the clinical environment as you guys are obviously managing a significant portfolio of clinical programs? Is that something you guys focus on, or do you defer that to your sponsors?
Yeah, I mean, what I was going to say is we tend to defer that to the sponsors. I think what Narinder said was particularly insightful. He is much closer to it. What I would say, though, high level, and this is a theme that you're going to hear, I think, in general and from me throughout the rest of this talk, is, it underscores the need to start these conversations and brainstorming sessions and conversations with vendor partners around supply chain as early as possible. And I know that that's a pretty big cliche these days, but I think this particular topic, specifically, really underscores, along with some other points that we'll talk about later on in the call, how starting these conversations as early as possible is really, really, really not only necessary but imperative. And I think this is a primary example of that, in addition to some of the additional downstream topics that we'll talk about here shortly.
Yeah, so we have one other question here, then we'll move on. That is, what is the thinking regarding manufacturers sending frozen infusion bags ready for use to sites of administration versus having the site of care go through the thaw, dilute bag process themselves? I'm not sure if you guys wanted to chat on that.
Maybe I can briefly talk about that. Obviously, the goal should be patient first, right? And in early clinical stages, you do want to give the site some controls, and as you're working through dosing, finding the right dose to create that flexibility. However, if this means a frozen product to the site where they can do a lot of manipulation, that creates its own risks. So the goal in our mind is always to think patient first, minimize the risk to the site and the patient. Once the product is out of hand, it's a challenge that it's a risk. So we want to minimize those manipulations at clinical sites.
Yeah, I think that's the predominant mindset, I think, of the space. However, obviously, there's some considerations related to the production of the material itself and what that process, the manufacturing process, looks like, whether or not it dictates dilution or non-dilution at the end, and obviously at the site of care. So, but I do think the preference is for it to be ready to go, thaw and inject versus thaw process before injection. All right. Let's go on to temperature controlled equipment management. So I'm going to start actually with a question to Natalie from the audience here. How does IQVIA oversee the logistical supply chain for cell and gene therapies, which is an inherent difficulty for clinical trials within the cell and gene space?
Yeah, great question. So one of the things that we've developed is a specific role. So it's our logistics manager role. And this role is not only specific to these therapies, but this role is dedicated, to the nuance and complexity around these therapies, cell therapy, gene edited cell therapies. And so what we do is we take an operational project team member and assign them to the project. And really, they are driving, obviously in conjunction with the sponsor, the logistical oversight and coordination of the trial. And one of the things I think that we do a little bit uniquely is we take a real holistic approach to the oversight of the logistics management framework. And by that, I mean, it's not just about tracking shipments from point A to point B. It's not just about overseeing temperature control adherence, although those are obviously critical. And it's also about chain of custody and chain of identity when applicable. But we also kind of take the holistic approach to what are the implications with respect to site training from a logistical standpoint. So we help train sites on the prep, handling, shipping, administration. Some of these gene therapies are complex administrations, the CNS setting, for example. So we take a training approach as well. So upfront, helping provide site training, helping drive site training, even doing on-site site training when appropriate. That includes things like helping coordinate dry runs for each site. So that logistics and supply chain manager role is really the embodiment of a logistics strategy that we put forth at the outset, and then helping to drive that strategy through this logistics manager role. A large portion of our logistics managers come from a clinical background. They're either nurses, nurse practitioners. Several of them have worked in cell therapy infusion settings. So not only are they experienced from a terminology and a consideration and risk consideration standpoint, but they're very comfortable and fluid in conversing with sites, speaking that language, looking at things like slot management and having those patient planning conversations. And so really they're very well poised to kind of be coordinating not just the product journey, but how does that product journey intersect with the patient journey? And I think helping to bring that together in a cohesive package is really what we've designed that role to do. So that's one of the key ways that we really fulfill that. I think strategy is fantastic, and you can have all the wonderful plans and all the wonderful PowerPoints and training in the world. But when you begin enrolling patients, you begin overseeing and participating in live shipments, that's when experience and planning really comes into effect. And you need to be able to pivot very quickly depending on what different things come up and arise. And so again, that's where that logistics manager role is really the embodiment of a strategy that we set forth long before the first shipment is ever started.
Yeah, Natalie, I think that's extremely important. Preparation is extremely important in doing your homework. So running validation studies around the lanes that you're supporting, as well as the equipment and transportation related considerations, running the process as it relates to IT and data transfer. And so, people wholly underrepresent the complexity of the data management strategy associated with these therapies in the field, in particular when you have 5, 6, 7 different parties that are tied into a single patient event, so to speak. And then, moving forward in a future state, the things that we're thinking about are going to be as it relates to scalability, warehousing, clinical site space constraints are significant, and they're going to get even worse. I mean, if you've ever been to a clinical site that's very active, in many cases, the material is coming into an area that's no bigger than a bedroom, right? And you have these large cryo shippers and 2 to 8 shippers and -80 shippers or whatever else ends up being able to manage the density of that equipment as it coming in and have clear line of sight on a custody and identity standpoint is obviously critically important. But the other thing we've seen personally on the transportation side of it, supply chain side of it, is thinking through the integration of the entire process. The worst thing you can do is make your choice on primary packaging without considering your secondary packaging, your transportation considerations, your obviously what the routing associated with it, the thermal profiles of inbound, outbound, any other ancillary materials that need to come in, whether you have tumor resected samples or other things that are coming in to augment the manufacturing process. There's a lot of additional elements that are extremely critical. And so thinking about these things early, right? And so you don't have the benefit of driving through a 15-year process like you would with a small molecule or biologic. Typically, the clinical pipeline here is running through from first patient to filing events in 5 to 7 years, which is a fraction of the time of the historical therapies. And so we've seen where you typically will take 2 to 3 years to plan your commercial launch strategy. In most cases, these folks are trying to deal with this in 6 to 9 months, which is a huge issue. So, Narinder, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Well, I'm just listening to you guys. You're the experts in this area. I'll maybe give it more of a manufacturing process perspective. I'm truly very proud of our supply chain team, who does an outstanding job of working with partners like you to deliver for patients every single time. We have a very small team, and they really give it their all. So the dedication that you see in our team or our teams in this broader context and all over the industry is just remarkable. They work well with the clinical teams, the CROs, logistic partners, and track every single patient, like you said, make sure that that we can deliver for the patient. One specific thing we have seen is delays that when they happen in manufacturing, that can have a huge impact on the manufacturing cadence. So if a slot were to is set for a day and the shipment arrives late due to weather or whatever challenge, that can create a huge challenge to manufacturing team to still process it within the same slot. So if you are at capacity, it's a big challenge, and therefore really operating actually thoughtfully below the top capacity is really critical here. We've been pretty lucky there, and now we have exceptional partnership with Kite Pharma, Kite Gilead, and they clearly have the world's best leaders in cell therapy supply and cell therapy manufacturing. So we're really fortunate in that sense, and our challenges are thankfully more mitigated.
Great. Thank you, Narinder. One more question here, then we'll move on to the next section. This comes from the audience. Can you speak to current storage capabilities, challenges, and trends in cell and gene therapy in the US and Europe, and also any other major markets? Maybe I can start on that and then let Natalie or Narinder tie in if they're interested. So storage obviously is a critical consideration, although it is very different than historical products, right? Because typically historical products are produced in bulk and stored and distributed through, folks like McKesson or AmerisourceBergen or whomever else, and they have a process to do what we call low value, high volume products, right? And so these, as it relates to consideration around cell and gene therapy. So everything is really around volumetric consideration and support to move high volume materials. Obviously, cell and gene is very, very different. Autologous is typically 1-to-1, and storage is limited typically to backup doses and or retains in support of a manufacturing process. It's very rare that you actually are storing the primary dosages unless it's very transient temporary storage at the clinical site or potentially in an intermediary site through, to support things like QP and drug product release or especially pharmacy release in the US. Allo is a different ballgame, right? So allo really, the challenge with allo is going to be over time is really going to be the handling of the product and as it relates to the secondary labeling. So secondary labeling of a cryogenically stored product is not a trivial exercise. It is a much more challenging exercise for folks to think about because you have adherence issues as it relates to cryogenic storage material. You obviously want to minimize the handling of these materials where, thermal deviation can destroy the product in seconds in many cases versus, biologic or small molecule that has a much much higher tolerance for thermal variability. And so, time out of environment is extremely important to be able to track efficiently. As we have the first larger volume allo product go to market, and I think some of these are just around the corner, the secondary challenge is going to be around fulfillment and pulling material out of cryogenic storage equipment in bulk, because you can only access that equipment on a very finite number of times before you have restrictions due to thermal impacts on the actual storage equipment itself. So, very, very well thought out fulfillment strategies associated with the secondary labeling and or the fulfillment and pick, pack, pull out of cryogenic storage equipment is going to be very, very critical. All right, I'm going to move along here just so because on a question of time here. So let's go down to the next one, which is data integration and visibility. All right, so one of the other areas here that we find is extremely important from a consideration standpoint is around systems integration, process-related and IT considerations as it relates to monitoring, patient journey-related considerations. If you go into a typical clinical site, they may have 5 or 6 different platforms they have to support, each with different logins. And so that integration process itself around data harmonization across multiple platforms, as well as providing ease of use in a fragmented environment is obviously something that is a significant growing pain from a scalability standpoint today. So maybe we start with Natalie. Do you want to comment on how you guys are dealing with data as it relates to clinical portfolios that you guys are supporting and how you guys are approaching that? And then we'll turn to Narinder on it.
Yeah, so, I think what I would say is, in having a thought about this, one of the key takeaways for me is that innovation is fantastic, and, having abilities to procure data is obviously now more important than ever. And innovation in that space is very robust, but innovation isn't always simplification. And so you have to be kind of aware of what are the knock-on effects for sites in particular. And as being a former coordinator myself, having an understanding of how these multiple systems and their integration or lack thereof impact sites, and particularly these very busy research centers, you have to be looking at what is the risk reward in adopting, some of these platforms and utilization of the data and harnessing of the data. So what we're always looking for ways to do is to be able to synchronize a lot of this data, have platforms, talk across each other, and as much as possible streamline the experience for the site. And I think that can only potentially improve the experience for the patient. if you have sites that are able to focus and relatively speaking, a little less stressed out by all of the different ways in which data is being collected and monitored. I think in these types of therapies, there's more data being put out than ever around the IP itself, obviously around the patient, around the manufacturing piece. And so making sure that things are as streamlined as possible is really something that we're looking to do, again, as one of those really direct parties interacting directly with sites. We're looking for ways, how can we streamline things without compromising, obviously, quality or safety, and getting things to talk to each other as much as possible, streamlining across databases for our sites.
Narinder, how are you guys dealing with it?
Yeah, well, this is the beast, right? For
It is a beast, yeah.
Cell therapies, the amount of data that you generate is tremendous. And this infrastructure is probably one of the key differentiating advantage for a company if they can have it. Now, many small companies cannot have it, and your needs are somewhat limited, phase 1, phase 2 trials. As you go commercial, this becomes really critical, I believe. And again, we are really fortunate to have a partnership with Kite Gilead, and they probably have one of the best infrastructure we could have imagined, and manufacturing network. So we are very happy with that. They have solved it, and we hope to leverage it. Yeah, would love to hear, Mark, from you. How are you thinking about providing help for smaller companies who do not have such access?
Yeah, I mean, what we're seeing is anytime that you're developing any sort of system to support the space, you have to think about its ability to integrate with other systems and how you share data, right? And so number one is obviously you have to think about the regulatory considerations and what data is being transferred, but you also have to think about the mechanism of transfer, right? And is it a push-pull? What is the requirement and the need base for that data that's being generated? And so what we have found is as you approach this, trying to be as open as possible as it relates to engagement and data transfer considerations with your API strategy, your engagement strategy, not trying to force every organization to stand up on your physical platform, but allow your platform to potentially run behind others as it relates and just feed data into it, or support and play in a supporting role, and don't just making sure that everything's mandated as you're the primary vehicle, because we have to be able to integrate these platforms over time. And the only way we're going to do that is having folks work in a collaborative manner, because, for us, it's extremely, and obviously chain of identity starts with either in a clinical standpoint, it'll be somebody like IQVIA as it relates to patient management. If it's commercial, it'll be coming from the clinical or the commercial sites themselves, potentially in many cases. And how do you deal with that data, and how do you integrate it to chain of custody, chain of condition related considerations, and that harmonization, is something that's extremely important. And then an area that folks haven't even really touched on yet, because it's really it's really, honestly, a bit early to even consider, but as long-term outcomes research, right? And so, what if you have a less than optimal result from a clinical program or a commercial activity? Is there aspects of supply chain that are impacting that product efficacy over time? And if you're not collecting all of this data in an actionable format, you don't have any idea whether or not if your cryopreservation or transportation strategy, inbound material, is going to have an impact on your efficacy. You don't know if it's going to be, some other aspect from a handling standpoint, from a storage standpoint, unless you are able to harmonize all that data against a given identifier and then be able to mine that data effectively. And so, one of the things that we've been pushing folks for is to create a consolidated quote unquote data dictionary, which really defines the terms of every piece of data that is in play as it relates to cell and gene, and provide standardization as it relates to the consideration of what that data is, how it's represented, and then ultimately the use case associated with that. All right. One last question here, and then we'll go on. Natalie, what are IQVIA's thoughts on how we can escape the platform fatigue reported by all the hospital sites?
Yeah, it's a good question, and one that, in my opinion, doesn't have a silver bullet answer, at least yet. I think, one of the things you want to look at is, where are there options to streamline? And by streamline, I mean, are there areas where you can potentially do things a little bit offline or a little bit more manual? Now, I know that, the word manual is kind of a bad word these days, but I think you want to look at the setting, you want to look at the potential complexities for that particular asset, that particular trial, and the sites that you're working with. I talked about that logistics manager role that we have a little bit earlier, and we've had some really nice case studies in some pretty small early phase 1 settings where we've been able to do things in a little bit more manual way. And I think sites in a way have kind of appreciated the reduction in the amount of platforms and sign-ons that they need to have. I think you want to be very cognizant and aware of what are the implications of going manual for some of these these items, and understand what are the risks inherent in those. And that's where that human element of a logistics supply chain manager, not just at the CRO, but the logistics team, at other vendors and at the sponsor, how can they really optimize the process? But platform fatigue is a big deal. I think what that's going to really require is two things. One, again, we've said it 100 times, but integration of these systems and databases over time, their ability to talk to one another. And if you can't get that yet, then you need somebody at the forefront, that human element, making things as cohesive and streamlined as possible. And so kind of overarching either platforms themselves that, tie in all this data together, or an individual that is acting as kind of, the oversight across all these databases and systems, and reporting that into and out of sites, reporting that into and out of manufacturing. But it is a big deal. I think ultimately it's going to have to come from a couple of different directions until we get to that time where databases very effortlessly talk to one another. I think you're going to look to find opportunities to streamline by either going a little bit more manual or introducing that human element when appropriate. But it's definitely an important consideration these days from the sites that we're talking to.
Yeah, I would agree. Great. Thank you, Natalie. All right, Natalie, let's move on to the final topic. We've got about 6 minutes left, I believe. And so this is around fulfillment related considerations. So, as I'd mentioned earlier in the call, back pre-2022, we had a patient volume, theoretical patient opportunity of around 50 to 60,000 patients. And in 2 or 3 years, we could be at 1.2 million patients a year from an opportunity standpoint. How do we, so the first question is, how do we handle scalability limitations, supply chain operations to meet growing demand? And Narinder, you guys may not be dealing with this yet, but as you guys get ready to file and go commercial, you're going to obviously have to step into the morass of the challenges that we've talked about from a scalability standpoint. So, how are you guys thinking about that? How are you guys preparing for those thought processes as it relates to limitations around supply chain?
I think about it every day, Mark, and multiple times a day. Although commercialization seems far away, it's really not for cell therapies, because, phase 2, pivotal, and then you are there, right? And it's a smaller trial. As a mission-driven company, Arcellx is a mission-driven company, and our goal is to really help the humanity with these therapies that can cure these diseases that haven't really found effective solutions so far. And then not only just do that, but also make it as broadly accessible as possible. And how do we achieve that? I think, to me, the big shout out to our supply chain team and the supplier partners like you guys and others who help us deliver these very complex therapies, not just for clinic, but beyond, right? So you have to think about resilience of the supply chain. You have to continuously pressure test all these things and design a process from the core that is going to be scalable. So that's the key thing. If people get logged in quick into coming into into clinic fast, but then they know it's going to be a challenge to establish comparability and make process changes. So start with the most effective product concept, design a process that can be scalable from the get-go. We spend a lot of time thinking about that. And then when you introduce it, you have to make changes because you're not going to be able to get the perfect process from the get-go. Work with agencies to really build the process from the design itself to be scalable. Once you have that, then get lucky and find the right partner who can help you deliver it. So those are my thoughts.
Natalie, yourself?
So yeah, when I think about scalability, I think there's the materials and manufacturing side of scalability. And then I think there's the, other areas of scalability, particularly where we come in. Scalability from our side really means how can you take solutions and subject matter experts from a supply chain perspective and apply those with equal precision and equal impact across, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and so on. Apply them from US only to global, from the traditional hematology oncology setting to CNS, rare disease, other therapeutic areas. And so what we're trying to do is really scale up our ability to, help from a variety of perspectives. I talked about the site network and always trying to grow that. I talked about some of our site training capabilities and solutions and scale and grow those. So I think as you look at scaling the raw materials and the manufacturing side of things and capability, you also kind of want to consider those other, areas to scale. I think another important thing that, we haven't really touched on yet is when you talk about scalability from a, global perspective, as a lot of these studies at least are going, into new regions where there's not been a lot of therapies like this before. Looking at things like drug depots and how can you make things a lot easier to scale from a global perspective and scale them much more rapidly than you might be able to, particularly on the allo side with drug depots. I think that's one way that we've looked at scaling things outside the traditional regions and areas that are a little bit more familiar with administering these therapies and kind of opening the globe up a little bit in areas like LATAM and the Middle East.
Thanks. Yeah. Just from our standpoint, there's a couple of considerations that we think about. First and foremost is going to be around moving from a human-intensive platform into a much more automated environment over time, right? So cell and gene is still a very, very human-intensive process, in particular in supply chain. Because of the fact that you can't have a product loss in the field, right? If you have a product loss, there's typically a patient death associated with it, and so you have basically a zero tolerance for failure, which means that you have to have a lot more eyes and ears on any of the processes associated with managing those supply chain considerations, and so automation of that oversight is going to be extremely critical. And if you've ever been in a war room on any of these organizations, that they have entire teams that are basically tracking the process of every single patient dose and the processes associated with it, each step along with it, and dealing with any of the exceptions. And so we have to have use things like AI to really drive automation of the exceptions in the instances where human operation is currently heavily dependent. The second one is around, and Natalie touched on this, on scalability is going to be facility and density management over time. So currently, from our perspective, a centralized approach to cell and gene therapy is not going to be effective over time for the exact reasons that Natalie just talked about. And so we've been very aggressively building infrastructure, across our family of companies. We now have 50 facilities in 17 countries. And that's for the sole purpose of being able to decentralize, to be able to provide more rapid turnaround time as it relates to availability of key supply chain related considerations, decentralization of storage and fulfillment related considerations, because a lot of these have very sensitive time limitations. So even when you have a patient event that occurs, in many instances, and we see this in a lot of the allo products, which are going to have more of that fulfillment related sensitivity, you can't wait a week or 2 weeks to get that product out the door. Sometimes it needs to be out the door and in the facility within 24 hours, which is a huge sensitivity as it relates to logistics considerations. And so having decentralized ability to drive equipment into a physical location very, very quickly, so fulfill and distribute very, very quickly, sometimes as little as hours, is extremely important. So those are just some elements that tie into it. And then the other one is around density management. So we're looking at equipment rework that allows us to store equipment in clinical sites at a much higher density, et cetera, and so forth, which really drives this. But we're actually out of time, so just wanted to wrap up here. Obviously myself, Narinder, and Natalie are available for follow-up on an as-needed basis. We're very, very happy and appreciate the folks' time here today. Obviously, we've just scratched the surface of supply chain considerations here. We could probably have a 3 or 4 day session just going through the nuances of all these elements over time. But I want to drive the audience to really think about this in a collaborative way. Open yourself up as it relates to discussion, engage parties, pull them together in the process, because over time that's going to be extremely critical for us to really drive efficiency in the supply chain over time and be able to support the volume associated with the future. So again, thank you for ARM for sponsoring and working with us on this, and we appreciate everybody's time again, and I hope everybody has a great afternoon.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks all.
Thanks so much,
Appreciate it.
everybody. It's been fun.